The drill bit screamed through ferrocrete 2 meters above his head, and Captain Dace Fenner felt his teeth ringing inside his skull. He could not move. He could not signal. He could not even tilt his neuro helmet to look up. The Hatchetman's torso was crushed motionless under 50 meters of collapsed roof, rendering its full head ejection system useless, and the only sound louder than the dying scrubber was that vibrating, insectile grind chewing toward his canopy. 9 hours of air. They would reach him in less than 1. He did not pray. He counted. He counted, because counting kept the panic small. 43 breaths per minute. Too fast. He forced it down to 20. The cockpit smelled of scorched insulation, sweat, and the bitter ozone of a coolant line that had ruptured somewhere behind his command couch and slowly painted his right shoulder wet. The emergency lighting was a single sullen amber strip above the main display, and the main display itself was cracked from one corner to the other, a jagged white lightning frozen across the tactical readout. The readout still worked. That was something. Captain Dace Fenner of the 8th Crucis Lancers, Recon Battalion, attached for this operation to the 1st Crucis Lancers on the Capellan border world of Tikhonov, took a slow breath through his nose and stared at what the Hatchetman could still tell him about the world. External temperature, 31 degrees Celsius. The complex was burning somewhere above. Atmospheric pressure inside the cockpit, nominal. Seal integrity, nominal. He almost laughed at that. The seal would hold beautifully right up until the drill kissed the canopy, and the canopy went, and so did he. Air supply, 8 hours, 51 minutes. The number kept dropping in tiny digital twitches. He had stopped looking at it after the first hour. He looked at it now because the drill changed everything. He clicked the comms open out of habit. Any station. Any station. This is Lancer 6-2. Buried. Requesting acknowledgement. Over. Static. Not even the polite static of a working channel reaching for a signal. This was the thick, dead static of a transmitter shouting into solid stone. He had tried it on every band the Hatchetman carried. Battalion Guard. Regimental Command. Search and Rescue. The Crucis Lancers shared frequency. The Civilian Emergency Band. In case anyone on the surface was listening for survivors. Nothing answered him, but the hiss of his own breath in the helmet, and the rising whine of the drill. 2 meters. The mics pegged the depth at 2.1 meters, and shrinking. Industrial salvage drills, Capellan pattern, were rated for 30 centimeters of ferrocrete a minute under load. They would slow in the rebar. They would not stop. He thought about the trigger. It sat under a hinged red guard on the auxiliary panel by his left knee. He had wired it himself 3 days ago before the drop, with a tech sergeant named Ula Davan watching him do it, because regulations required 2 sets of eyes on any field-rigged ordnance. The trigger fed a hard line that ran down the Hatchetman's left leg, out through a service port he had cut with a handheld fusion torch, and into a junction box at the base of the orbital cannon's primary fusion reactor. The junction box held 4 kilograms of plastic explosive shaped to crack the reactor's magnetic containment. The reactor, deprived of containment, would do the rest. Nobody else on Tikhonov knew the charge existed. Not the Crucis Lancer's colonel who had given him the secondary objective. Not Davin, who had since been killed by an SRM carrier 2 ridgelines east. Not the Capellan salvage crews above him who were even now drilling toward what they thought was a trapped Davion mech warrior worth ransom or interrogation. The trigger would take everything within 400 meters down with him. The salvage crews. Their hauler, the half-dismantled remains of 2 House Liao mechs that had died trying to stop him from reaching the cannon in the first place. And whatever the Maskarovka had sent down to make sure the cannon's secrets did not end up in Davion hands. 8 hours, 48 minutes. He closed his eyes. He saw, against the inside of his eyelids, the orbital cannon as it had looked from the ridge 3 days ago. A black needle, 40 meters tall, sleeved in ferrocrete revetments, pointing at the sky like an accusation, capable of putting a slug through the belly of a Union-class dropship in low orbit, capable of denying the entire northern hemisphere of Tikhonov to the Federated Sun's invasion fleet for as long as it stood. The first Crucis Lancer's colonel had spread his hands across the holotable and said, in the dry voice of a man who has lost too many friends to orbital fire, "Captain Fenner, this thing has to be a hole in the ground by Tuesday." And Fenner had said, "Yes, sir." Now it was Tuesday. The cannon was a hole in the ground. He was at the bottom of the hole. The drill changed pitch. It had hit rebar. The whine deepened, became a bone-deep grinding, and the Hatchetman's hull transmitted the vibration up through the command couch and into the base of his spine, like a dental procedure being performed on the mech itself. He listened, despite himself, with the attention of a man trying to identify a bird from its song. The drill was a Hellespont Industries pattern, he thought. He had seen them on Liao construction sites during peacetime exercises. Before the war turned peacetime into a memory, they had a distinct triple helix bit that screamed at a particular frequency under load. If he was right, the bit would chew through the rebar in about 40 minutes. Then it would be back into clean ferrocrete. And clean ferrocrete fell to a Hellespont drill at 30 centimeters a minute. He did the math twice, because he did not trust himself the first time. He had between 60 and 70 minutes before the bit found his canopy. 70 minutes to decide. He could pull the trigger now. He could end it now, fast, and take the salvage crews with him. And the colonel would hear in 3 days that the orbital cannon and its surviving infrastructure had been buried so deeply that the Capellans would not recover so much as a scrap of useful telemetry. Mission accomplished. Captain Dace Fenner of the 8th Crucis Lancers, killed in action, posthumous Medal of Excalibur, name on a wall. Or he could wait. Wait for the drill to come closer. Wait for the Capellan salvage chief to look down through the hole and see the Hatchetman's broken canopy and the man inside it. Wait until the explosion would catch not just the salvage crews, but also whatever their reinforcements had brought to the site, and the recovery hauler, and the technical specialists the Maskarovka had certainly sent down by now. Wait for the maximum kill. The longer he waited, the more he killed. The longer he waited, the more time the air had to run out before the drill arrived, in which case he would die alone in the dark, with his hand on a trigger he had been too patient to pull. He thought about that. He thought about it the way a man thinks about a chess problem when the clock is running. He thought about Ulla Davin, who had laughed at him 3 days ago because he asked her twice whether the wiring tolerances were correct. "Captain," she had said, with that flat Lyran accent that turned every sentence into a small pronouncement. "If I have made an error, you will not be there to complain about it." She had been right. She had also been wrong, because the error she did not make had instead trapped him in the place where her work was supposed to save him. He thought about his daughter Liz, who was 11 years old on New Avalon, and who would receive a folded flag and a letter and a very small pension, and would grow up understanding that her father had died the way her father had always told her soldiers sometimes died, which is to say, without warning, and without witnesses, and without the kindness of a body to bury. He stopped thinking about Liz because he had work to do. The drill bit deeper. The Hatchetman's mics, sensitive enough to track footsteps at 200 meters in clean conditions, picked up other things too. Secondary sounds layered under the primary scream. Voices, compelling by the cadence, though the rubble distorted the words past intelligibility. The dull thump of heavier equipment moving on the surface above. The intermittent shriek of cutting torches working on something else. Probably the wrecked Vindicator he had put down with the hatchet. On his way in, they would strip that mech for parts before they finished excavating him. Standard Capellan salvage protocol. Recover what is easy first. Earn the dangerous prize last. 8 hours, 39 minutes. The scrubber whined a half-octave higher, and he flinched. He keyed the diagnostic and asked the Hatchetman what it could tell him about its own dying. The answer scrolled past in clipped engineering shorthand. Carbon dioxide scrubber, primary cartridge, 92% saturated. Secondary cartridge, failed at insertion, likely impact damage. Backup chemical absorber, deployed, 23% capacity remaining. Cabin oxygen partial pressure, 19.1 kilopascals, dropping 0.03 per hour. Estimated time to incapacitation, at current rate, 6 hours, 50 minutes. Estimated time to lethality, 8 hours, 38 minutes. He stared at the gap between incapacitation and lethality. 1 hour, 48 minutes between losing consciousness and dying. 1 hour, 48 minutes during which his hand could not pull a trigger. That changed the math again. He could not afford to wait until the drill found him. He could not afford to wait until the air ran out. The window was narrower than he had thought, because the window closed when his hand stopped working, not when his heart stopped beating. 70 minutes until the drill, perhaps. 6 hours and 50 minutes until his hand stopped obeying him. The drill won the race. Comfortably. So he would wait for the drill. He would let them get close. Close enough to be sure. He almost smiled. He had heard old Crucis Lancer veterans, men who had fought on Mallory's World and Halstead Station and Stein's Folly, talk about the strange peace that came over a soldier when the decision had been made and only the timing remained. He had not believed them. He had thought it was the kind of thing men said afterward, to make themselves sound braver than they had been. He believed them now. There was a peace. It was not the peace of acceptance. It was the peace of arithmetic. He keyed the comms one more time, not because he expected an answer, but because military procedure said you transmitted as long as you had power, and military procedure was the one thing he had left that worked. Any station. Any station. This is Lancer 6-2. Primary objective achieved. Secondary objective in progress. Estimate completion. Within 1 hour. Mark. His voice was steadier than he had expected. 6-2. Out. The static did not change. He let the comms close and listened to the drill. The drill, as if hearing him, suddenly stopped. For a long moment he heard nothing but his own breath and the scrubber's whine, and a distant secondary clatter that might have been a ventilator or might have been somebody dropping a wrench. Then the drill started again, but it had moved. The vibration was farther away now, off to his left, perhaps 3 meters lateral. They had hit something. They had repositioned. He understood with a small, cold clarity that they were not drilling blind. They had a sensor reading on the cockpit. They had probably been pinged by a thumper sonar set above the rubble. They knew exactly where his head was, and they were drilling to a point that would not collapse the cockpit on top of him. They wanted him alive. That was good. Salvage crews who wanted a mech warrior alive worked slowly, checked their angles, brought up the drill, and then the cutting torch, and then the rescue rig in sequence. It would buy him time. It also meant the salvage chief above him was experienced, probably ex-military, probably aware that a captured Davion officer attached to the first Crucis Lancers was worth, in Maskirovka coin, a great deal more than a dead one. He filed that away, not because it changed the trigger decision, because experienced salvage chiefs brought experienced support. And experienced support meant heavy haulers and command vehicles and senior officers all clustered around the dig site. And that meant the trigger would catch not just the labor crews, but the Liao chain of command for the whole salvage operation. He breathed slower. The drill resumed its grinding. He watched the air number tick down. 6 hours, 50 minutes give or take, until his hand stopped working. He was going to use them. He started, of all things, with inventory. There was nothing else to do. He could not move his torso, could not move his arms beyond the wrist actuators inside the command couch, could not even rotate the Hatchetman's head. The main gyro and every servo above the waist were reading red on the diagnostic. But the cockpit itself was a small, intact universe, and it had things in it. A survival kit strapped to the back of the command couch. He could not reach it. A sidearm, a Magna laser pistol, in the holster clipped to his right thigh. He could reach that. A canteen, half full of warm water that tasted of plastic, clipped to the couch on his left. He drank from it slowly. Hydration would not save him. Dehydration would make him stupid. Stupid would make him pull the trigger early or late, neither of which served the mission. A med kit, sealed, on the bulkhead behind his right shoulder. Out of reach, a small printed photograph tucked into the corner of the main display, where it would not interfere with the readouts. Liz at 6, holding a fishing rod twice as long as she was, laughing at something her mother had said behind the camera. He looked at it once, briefly, and then looked away. A second laminated card listing emergency scuttling procedures to deliberately slag the fusion engine and avionics. A deliberate scuttle on the Hatchetman would overload the system, melt the internal myomers, and turn the mech into a useless tomb. It would not breach the rubble above him. It would simply kill the mech and accomplish nothing else. The standard scuttling protocol was for keeping technology out of enemy hands, not for taking enemies with you. He had wired the cannon charge precisely because standard mech scuttling was inadequate to the mission. A flask. He was not going to think about the flask. He was going to think about the flask. It was empty. He had drunk it on the descent, against regulations. And he was not sorry. The drill ground on. The pitch shifted again. Ferrocrete now. Clean. The bit had passed the rebar and was eating at 30 centimeters a minute, he computed. 2 meters of ferrocrete remaining, less the displacement already chewed, at 30 centimeters a minute, was approximately 6 minutes to canopy contact, plus whatever time the chief needed to bring up his secondary equipment. He had been wrong about the 70 minutes. He had been wrong by an order of magnitude. The drill was much closer than he had thought, because it had not been drilling straight down. It had been drilling diagonally, working around the rubble lattice, finding the paths of least resistance. He should have realized that earlier. The Hellespont's pitch had been changing for a reason. 6 minutes. The piece cracked. He felt it crack. The arithmetic was suddenly running against him, and he had been admiring it, and now it was almost too late. He forced his hand onto the auxiliary panel. The hinged red guard came up under his thumb with a small mechanical click that was, in the cathedral's silence between drill cycles, the loudest sound he had heard in 3 hours. His thumb hovered over the trigger, he thought. Not yet. Not yet. The chief is up there. The chief has not yet been joined by the recovery hauler. The maximum kill is not yet achieved. He thought. Yes, now, while my hand still works. Now, before the drill reaches the canopy, and a Capellan tech, who is not the chief, is the one who dies in the first instant, he thought viciously. Stop bargaining. He set his thumb down on the trigger guard, not the trigger, and waited. The drill stopped. It did not slow. It stopped. He listened. He listened the way a man listens when he has heard a sound at night in his own house. The mics picked up voices above, more clearly now, because the drill was no longer screaming. Capellan, accented, urgent. Then, a second voice, calmer, asking a question. Then a third voice, sharper, female, giving an order. He did not speak Capellan well. He spoke it well enough. The third voice had said, "Bring the cutter." He almost let go of the trigger guard in pure relief. The cutter meant another delay. The cutter meant the chief had decided that the drill alone was too risky for a clean recovery. The cutter meant somebody was bringing up a plasma torch and a stabilizing rig, and probably a medical bay technician, all of which had to be lowered on cables down the access shaft they had presumably cleared on the surface. That was minutes more. That was the recovery hauler arriving, if it had not already. The piece returned, smaller this time, more cautious. His comms crackled. He stared at the panel. The static had changed. Not gone, but changed. There was a structure in it now. A faint rhythmic pulse. The kind of pulse a directional transmitter made when it was trying to find a target through interference. Somebody was scanning for him. He keyed the receiver up. The pulse resolved, slowly, into a voice. Female. Davian accent. Cutting in and out as the signal threaded through whatever gap in the rubble had opened. 6-2. This is Lancer Actual. Do you copy? Lancer 6-2. This is Lancer Actual. Do. He nearly broke his thumb getting it onto the transmit key. Lancer Actual. Lancer 6-2. I copy weak but readable. I am buried. Repeat. I am buried. Do you copy? A pause. Then. 2. Copy buried. Copy buried. We have your beacon. We have a recon flight inbound your position. ETA 12 minutes. Hold, hold, hold. 12 minutes. The cutter would arrive in less. He thought, with a dry inner laugh that was almost a sob. Of course. Of course the cavalry comes when the trigger is already under your thumb. Of course. Lancer Actual. 6-2. Be advised, I have hostile salvage on top of me. Drilling? Contact in approximately 5 minutes. Repeat, hostile contact in 5 mics. Can your recon flight engage on arrival? The pause this time was longer. The static thickened, finned, thickened again. 6-2, Lancer Actual. Recon flight is 2 Sparrowhawks and a Corsair. Aerospace fighters. They will engage, but cannot, repeat, cannot, guarantee suppression of a salvage company in 5 minutes. Heavier elements, 30 minutes out. Do you have the means to delay? Over. 2 Sparrowhawks and a Corsair. Aerospace fighters against whatever the Capellans had brought to a salvage operation. Even if the salvage crews had only their armed escort, that escort would be at least a lance of medium mechs, probably with a heavy in support. The recon flight would die in 3 minutes, and not save him. Lancer Actual 6-2. Negative on delay. My mech is immobilized. Comms are the only thing working. He hesitated. The next words were the hardest he had ever spoken into a microphone. Be advised, Lancer Actual. I have a charge wired into the cannon's primary reactor. I can detonate from the cockpit. If I detonate, I take the salvage operation with me. Standing by for instructions. Over. The static breathed. He waited. Above him, the cutter arrived. He heard it, the high, steady hiss of plasma cycling up, and he heard the chief's voice giving directions. Calmer now. Methodical. The voice of a professional who had pulled mech warriors out of worse holes than this. 6-2, Lancer Actual. The female voice was different now, tighter. He recognized in it the particular flatness of a senior officer making a decision they did not want to make. 6-2. This is Colonel Marasevi, 1st Crucis Lancers. I have your situation. The cannon's destruction is confirmed. Your secondary objective is at your discretion. I say again, your discretion. We will not order it. Your call, Captain. Over. He closed his eyes. He had wanted, somewhere deep down, for them to order it. He had wanted to be a soldier following a command. Colonel Sevi, whom he had met exactly once over a holotable and remembered as a small woman with a long gray braid and tired eyes, had refused him that comfort. She had, in 2 sentences, given him back his own conscience, and he hated her for it, and he respected her for it, and he understood why she had done it. Lancer Actual 6-2, copy discretion. He thought. Now, about Liss. He let himself, for one moment. Then he thought about the colonel of the 1st Crucis Lancers, who had said 3 days ago that the cannon needed to be a hole in the ground by Tuesday. He thought about the Crucis Lancer's lance that had died on the approach so that he could plant the charge. He thought about the gunner crews on those orbital pieces who had not yet been rotated out, who had likely died in the cannon's collapse, and who had been Capellan conscripts who would have rather been farming. He thought about the Capellan chief above him, who was good at her job, and the cutter operator, who was probably 23 years old and thinking about dinner. He thought about the war that had asked all of them to be here. Lancer Actual 6-2. His voice was steady. He was surprised again. Request you log this transmission. I am going to wait until the cutter breaches the canopy. I am going to confirm the chief's identity if I can, and I am going to detonate when I have the maximum target on the surface. Estimate detonation in 7 to 9 minutes. After detonation, please ensure my daughter, Lysandra Fenner, age 11, on New Avalon, receives the standard packet. Tell her. He paused. He tried 3 different sentences in his head and discarded all of them. Tell her her father said hello. 6-2 out. 6-2. Lancer Actual. Transmission logged. Recon flight will mark the site and provide the after action. Godspeed. Captain. Lancer Actual out. The static returned to its old emptiness. The cutter hissed louder. He could see in his mind the plasma torch tracing a circle around the spot where the drill had marked. They would cut a plug out of the ferrocrete and lift it, and below it would be the broken roof of the Hatchetman, and below that, only a thin layer now, would be his canopy. He thought, with sudden practical clarity, about the canopy itself. The Hatchetman's canopy was tough. It was rated to resist small arms fire and shrapnel in the casual abuse of combat. It would not resist a plasma cutter aimed at it directly. But the cutter was not aimed at it directly. The cutter was carving ferrocrete 2 meters above. When the ferrocrete plug came out, what came next would be a cable and a person, and possibly a small drill or saw to crack the canopy from above, with surgical care. That meant he had a small additional buffer. The chief would not blow the canopy. The chief would lower a tech, who would assess, who would call up for the appropriate tool which would be lowered, which would take time. He would have a clear acoustic indicator when the plug came out. The hiss of the cutter would stop, and the rubble would shift, and the chief's voice would come through the new opening with much greater clarity. He would wait for that. He would wait for the chief to lean down and look. He would, If he could manage it, exchange one word with her. He owed her that, in some way he could not fully articulate. Then he would pull the trigger. His thumb stayed on the guard. The cutter hissed. The cutter hissed. The cutter stopped. There was the dull, expected sound of stone shifting, a heavy plug being lifted by cable, and then a sudden change in the acoustic profile of the cockpit. The mics picked up open air now. They picked up the wind on the surface. 50 meters of wind funneling down a freshly cut shaft. They picked up the chief's voice. Female, low, professional. She said, "In Capellan, lower the lamp. I want to see what we have." A second voice, male, "Yes, ma'am." A long pause. The chief was waiting for the lamp to be rigged. He could hear her breathing through the new opening. She had leaned down over the hole. He could hear faintly the hum of generators on the surface, and the deeper, more distant rumble of the recovery hauler's idling engines. And beyond that, yes, the crackling whine of at least one Mech's fusion plant on Overwatch. The chief had her command vehicle on top of him. She had the recovery hauler. She had at least one escort mech. She had her cutting team and her tech crew, and probably a Maskarovka observer. This was the maximum target. He lifted his thumb off the guard and set it on the trigger. He did not press. He waited for the lamp. The lamp came down on a cable, swinging slightly, and he saw its glow refract through the canopy's cracks, a cold, white industrial floodlight throwing his cockpit into sudden visibility. He saw, for the first time in 5 hours, his own hands on the controls. He saw the trigger panel under his left hand. He saw on the cracked main display his own face faintly reflected, a man in a Neuro helmet with gray at the temples, and a streak of dried blood from the corner of his mouth where he had bitten his cheek during the collapse and not noticed. The chief leaned into the light. He could see her dimly through the cracked glass, a face framed by short black hair, a hard mouth, an environmental suit collar with a salvage chief's tab, and below it, the small red cog of the Capellan Confederation's Industrial Reserve. She was perhaps 40. Her eyes were narrow with concentration, not malice. She saw him. He saw her see him. Her mouth tightened in what he recognized. Across all the borders and languages and uniforms in the inner sphere, as the universal expression of a salvage chief realizing the prize was alive. She said, in clear, careful English, "Captain, can you hear me? Hold still. We are going to get you out." He keyed his external speaker. His voice came out hoarser than he expected, amplified through the Hatchetman's chest-mounted hailer up the open shaft. "Chief, what's your name?" She blinked. Whatever she had expected him to say, that had not been it. After a moment, she answered, "Senior Salvager Hanji 1, Capellan Reserve Technical Corps." Hanji 1. He tasted the name. He committed it to the memory he had a few minutes left to keep. "I want you to know that you did good work today. Your team is professional. You found me fast." She frowned. "Captain, do me one favor." "What favor?" get your people back from the hole." The frown deepened. She studied his face through the canopy. She was, he saw, very smart. He saw her understand. She turned her head sharply and shouted something in Capellan up the shaft. He caught the word for clear, and the word for now, and the word for the kind of explosive vest a martyr might wear. Above, he heard sudden movement. Boots. Voices raised in alarm. The clatter of equipment being dropped. She turned back to him. She did not run. She had not climbed out of the shaft. She was still leaning over his canopy, her hard mouth set, her eyes locked on his. "Captain, whatever you have, do not. We can talk. There is always a thing to talk about." "There isn't, Chief." He was surprised by how gentle his own voice sounded. "There really isn't. You should go. I am the chief. I do not go first. You will today." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said quietly, and only he could hear it because the shaft funneled her voice straight down. "Your daughter." He flinched. He had not expected that. "What? You said it on the radio. Your radio talks. We listen." Lysandra. 11. New Avalon. Her face did not change. "I have a son. 12. Xian. We are not different, you and I. Do not do this thing. Come up. We will talk. The war will end one day." He stared at her. He understood with a clean, cold understanding that she was not lying. She was a salvage chief, not an interrogator. She had a son. Her radio operators had picked up his transmission to Colonel Sevi and passed it to her, and she had used what she heard, but she had not invented it. He understood, also, that this was the moment in which a man could be talked out of his duty. He thought about Lys. He thought about what Lys would want him to do. He thought, with sudden clarity, that Lys was 11 and would want him to come home, and that if he came home, he would come home as a man who had been talked out of his duty, and that the man who came home would not be the man Lys remembered, and that she would know. Eventually, in the slow way children come to know such things, that her father had bargained for his life with the lives of the men in the cannon, and the lance that had died for him, and the colonel who had given him discretion. He thought she would forgive him. He thought he would not forgive himself. He thought that the man who could not forgive himself was not the father Lys deserved, and that the death she would receive in a folded flag packet was kinder than the man she would receive alive. He thought all of that in less than 2 seconds, because he had thought most of it already, in the long hours before the drill arrived, and now it only had to be confirmed. "Chief Han," his voice was very quiet, "tell your son his mother was brave." He saw in her face the moment she understood that she had failed. He saw, for 1/2 second, something almost like respect. She turned, then, and ran for the cable. He gave her 2 seconds. He gave her 2 seconds, because he was not a monster. 2 seconds would not get her out of the kill radius. 2 seconds would get her up the cable and into the shaft, where her body might be shielded by the ferrocrete from the worst of the initial blast. It was a small gift. It was the only gift left to him. Then he pressed the trigger. The hard line carried the signal down the Hatchetman's leg, out through the service port, through the rubble along the path Sergeant Davin had laid 3 days ago, into the junction box at the base of the ruined cannon's reactor. The plastic explosive shaped its charge against the magnetic containment housing exactly as it had been designed to do. The reactor lost containment. He did not hear the explosion. He felt it. He felt it as a sudden, enormous pressure. A hand closing over the cockpit. A wave of pure force translated through 50 meters of rubble and 400 meters of horizontal distance, and the broken hull of his own mech. He felt the Hatchetman lift. He felt the canopy go. He felt heat and light and a whiteout that was not light because his eyes had already closed. He thought very clearly in the last moment, "I hope she made it to the cable." Then he did not think anything. On the surface of Tikhonov, 50 meters above what had been the orbital cannon's primary reactor housing, and was now a glowing crater 200 meters across, the recon flight of 2 Sparrowhawks and a Corsair from the 1st Crucis Lancers arrived 11 minutes late. They circled the site at 5,000 meters altitude, close enough to confirm, far enough to avoid the residual radiation. The flight leader, Lieutenant Anya Varick, 26 years old, 3 years out of the new Avalon Military Academy, looked down at the crater and at the scorched and tumbled wreckage of what had been a Capellan salvage operation. And she keyed her command channel. Lancer Actual, Recon 1. On site. Cannon complex is. There is no cannon complex. The whole hill is gone. I count 1 Vindicator wreck partially intact at the northern edge. What looks like a heavy salvage hauler on its side. A command track burning, and a lot of personnel signatures that are not moving. There is a survivor moving in the access shaft on the southern slope. 1 signature, climbing out. Static. Lancer Actual to Recon 1. Confirm 1 survivor. Recon 1 confirms 1. Looks like a Capellan tech officer. She's just sitting on the lip of the shaft, ma'am. She's not running. She's just sitting there. A long pause on the command channel. Recon 1, Lancer Actual. Do not engage the survivor. Mark the site. Return to base. We will recover the after action when the radiation clears. Copy. Lancer Actual. Recon 1. Returning. The flight banked east. The crater glowed red behind them, slowly cooling under the blue Tikhonov sky, and the tumbled shape of a Hatchetman that no instrument would ever again identify as a Hatchetman lay buried under what had once been buried it. 50 meters deep now, and deeper still where the reactor had sunk a glassy throat into the bedrock. Senior Salvager Han-Ji-won sat on the lip of the access shaft for a long time. She had reached the cable. She had reached the cable because a Davion captain, whose name she did not know, had given her 2 seconds, and she had used them. And the shaft had funneled the worst of the blast wave above her head, and broken her left arm and burst both her eardrums, and left her alive. She could not hear the Davion scout flight overhead. She saw them, distantly, 3 small shapes against the sky, and she understood that they had chosen not to shoot her. And she thought about that for a while too. When she could stand, she walked. She walked east, away from the crater, toward the line where she thought her own people might still be. She had a son in Sion, 12 years old, who would want her to come home. She walked, and she did not look back, and she carried with her for the rest of her life the memory of a man's face behind cracked canopy glass, and the words, "Tell your son his mother was brave." 3 weeks later, on New Avalon, Lysandra Fenner, 11 years old, received a folded flag and a letter and a small sealed envelope that contained a printed photograph of herself at 6 years old, holding a fishing rod twice as long as she was, laughing. The letter from Colonel Mara Sevi of the 1st Crucis Lancers said many of the things such letters say. It said that her father had completed his mission. It said that he had been offered the chance to surrender and had declined. It said that he had asked, in his last transmission, that his daughter be told that he said hello. The letter did not say everything. Letters of that kind never do. What the letter did not say was that on the night Captain Dace Fenner of the 8th Crucis Lancers pressed the trigger 50 meters under the surface of Tikhonov, the Federated Sun's invasion fleet that had been holding above the planet's stratosphere, unable to descend through the cannon's firing arc, finally came down. They came down all at once, in a long, bright rain of drop ships, and they took the northern continent in 9 days, and the war on Tikhonov turned, and turned again, and ended at last in an armistice that nobody had thought possible 6 months before. The cannon, had it remained, would have prevented the descent. The cannon, gone, made the descent possible. The Capellan Salvage Company that had been removed by the explosion would have, had it remained, recovered enough telemetry to reverse engineer the Star League-era targeting telemetry for their aerospace defense network within 4 months. The Salvage Company, gone, made that impossible. The Colonel did not write that, because the Colonel did not write what a daughter could not yet understand. The Colonel wrote, instead, the only sentence that mattered, which was at the bottom of the letter, in her own handwriting, beneath the printed signature. He chose. The Colonel had written. He chose. And his choice mattered. And it will go on mattering long after we have all forgotten his name. Lysandra Fenner read the letter once. She folded it. She put it in the drawer of her bedside table, on top of the photograph her father had carried into the cockpit and the flag the Colonel had sent. She closed the drawer. She went to the window and she looked out at the sky over New Avalon, where, somewhere very far away, and on the other side of a war, a Capellan woman with a broken arm was walking east toward her son. Lysandra Fenner did not cry that night. She would, later. She would cry many times. But that night, she only stood at the window, and she said quietly, to nobody at all, the only thing she could think to say. She said, "Hello, Dad." And in the silence that followed, the kind of silence that settles only over houses where a soldier has not come home, she understood in the first small way that an 11-year-old can understand such a thing, that her father had answered her.